Hello. It is Friday, April 4th, 2025. My name is Damien DeNoble. This is the H-2B update for today. We got a big one. Now, before I begin, in the description below, there is a link to our new newsletter. Okay. The newsletter is going to come out every Monday is the plan. I'm just going to kind of tell you what I learned about the H-2B program in that week. So if you're an employer, I'll teach you how to be a better H-2B employer. If you are an employee, if you're looking for work in H-2B, I will teach you how to be a better employee. If you're a recruiter, I'm going to tell you what I learned from other recruiters, because recruiters, like the good ones, are the best ones in this biz. So again, there is a newsletter you can sign up for on the bottom that's going to start going out 2 weeks from now. So I want to see how many people sign up, and then I'm going to go for it. But again, check out the link at the bottom and you can sign up for a newsletter. Big day today. This has been a big day in terms of H-2B news. So for those of you who are unaware, last week, the H-2B returning worker allocation was released after some 3 weeks of waiting. This was not normal. In prior years, we would get a, hey, it's Devin Smith. Nice to see you again. Thanks, Devin. I'm going to answer all questions at the end. So if you do have questions during what this is a live stream, if you're watching it later, I can't answer them. But if you have questions and you're watching, just leave them in there and I'll answer them at the end of the show. Okay. But let me give you an update. So last week, the returning worker allocation was released. So that means all those additional workers that you could apply for using a CA-9 form, you could officially file for starting on Wednesday night. Now, effectively, unless you are in Texas, you probably didn't get an application in on Thursday because the release was only made. We only learned about it around 5:30, 6 p.m. East Coast time. So maybe in Texas, you could have gotten down to FedEx and had them, send something to Texas Service Center the same day. But otherwise, effectively, the first day of filing for everybody else was on that Friday. So today is the 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st, 31st, 32nd. So it's the 28th would have been the first day you could have gotten in a returning worker application. And that begs the question of when is the returning worker cap going to be hit? There's about over 37,000 H-2Bs have been certified. That's about how many we think you need to, meet the regular cap. Okay, so we think that the cap for the H-2Bs, these additional ones, based on the same sort of numbers, where you look at how many certifications there are, it could probably be met either today, potentially at the start of next week. So if you haven't gotten your application in, I would say today is probably your last bet to overnight it to get it in by Monday for returning workers. That being said, we waited and waited and waited for the receipts to come out of the Texas Service Center, but they didn't arrive until last night. Most likely, right, just a generous explanation for that is that Texas Service Center was waiting to see if they would have more applications for returning workers than there were returning worker slots available, to see if they needed to hold a lottery. Once they started releasing the receipts last night without a lottery announcement, it means that there are more spots. Okay, so that's another clue as to when the cap might be met. But again, I think the cap might be met as early as next week. Why? Why so fast? Why is the H-2B additional worker cap so fast? Well, because you had a 21-day wait time until this cap was announced. You effectively gave all the other groups, all the groups, C, D, E, right, potentially even F, time to complete their recruiting and apply for these additional workers. Now, there's a bit of a wrinkle there. Department of Labor was holding on certifications. They were really slow walking certifications. You get your recruitment report in. It's been taking about 6 days, for about 2.5 weeks to get an approval. And part of that was probably coordinating with USCIS so there wouldn't be an overload in the system. But still, I expect that a lot of people did file in the last 3, 4, 5 days. And so again, we're going to be hitting the cap next week. What am I learning from this experience? You might have noticed there's a lot of change at the federal government level. And I've been talking about this really for the past year, that we could expect changes in a new administration as to how the program is administered, not the very least because of the restructuring of the entire federal government, but also because of competing views within Republican politics of what the H-2B program is. So on the one hand, you have H-2B champions. So you're talking about your Tom Tillis's, you're talking about your Senator Harris. You're talking about your Mikowskis. And the reason they're champions is because they have a lot of small business owners, but also farmers, hospitality industry, people, right, in their states that depend on both H-2A workers and H-2Bs. On the other hand, you have a band of Republicans who more or less see this seasonal worker program as an extension of overly generous immigration policies. And those two sides, have constantly been fighting inside of the Republican Party. And I think we saw some of that this year with the delay in the H-2B program. I'm just speculating, but that's probably what was happening. Because if you look at Project 2025, the H-2B section is one of the rare sections in Project 2025 where there are competing views presented within the document. Literally, they say, here's two competing views on whether the H-2B program itself is bad or good and whether it should be kept or abolished. Okay, it's worth noting that the dominant narrative on the H-2Bs is that it should be phased out over a 10-year period. But there's also a very explicit paragraph in there saying the H-2B program is good for American businesses. And so what does that mean? Well, on the one hand, we saw in the past 3 months how this competing narrative really led to some delays in processing. We are also seeing, it's worth pointing out, delays at the consular level because of additional vetting of H-2B candidates. So right now, if you're looking for an interview in Mexico, it's probably going to go out to late April, early May. But I've heard of there being a lot of kind of stuck applications in very popular posts, including Jamaica, including the Central American consulates and Mexico over the past couple of months, as there's been a sort of effort to figure out how do you implement the vetting priorities of the current administration. But what we also saw with this delay is a preview of what we might see in next year's cycle, which is this idea that you're going to have an internal, perhaps, fight or battle over what should be the direction of the program in any given year. And I think it's a coin flip right now. Again, we have these two competing Republican political priorities, ideas of what the H-2B program is. But right now it's a coin flip of whether we're going to see additional workers released for the following season, right? The champions won this year, and it's worth noting again that President Donald Trump himself has H-2B workers, famously at Mar-a-Lago. But we don't know if that's going to continue, right? It's safe to say that a lot of things are up in the air. We're in a very unprecedented situation. So what that means, if you're an employer or an employee, that has some implications. First of all, if you're an employer, you should be thinking about how to implement a maximal impact strategy in the lottery. Because if we enter a world where the only types of workers we have are the 33,000 workers released per half annum, per half year, and cap exempt workers, well, then how you do in the lottery is going to be paramount. If you don't get Group A or Group B, you're going to have no chance of bringing in any kind of worker that's not already in the United States. And you're going to be competing. Any additional workers are going to be the ones already in the United States. You'll be competing with everybody else. So that means that you should be competing. Probably right now, you should be making sure that the workers you do have, that you stay in touch with them, that you treat them well. I mean, you should always treat them well, but you should really be seeing them for what they are, which is very, very valuable assets. And so just making sure that you maximize your relationships is going to be very important, because we could enter a world with no additional workers, at least for some time. Now, there are lots of efforts underway to put in all sorts of cap exemptions into this program to allow workers who have gotten H-2B workers in the past to bring those workers in under the cap. All that stuff is happening in the background. But again, if we assume that there's a battle within the Republican Party and there's no consensus, then we should assume that there's a coin flip that in either year you could get the additional workers released, or you can get them pulled depending on who has more influence within the Department of Homeland Security and perhaps other things. The other thing that we know is that the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Labor, U.S. consulates, right? These are three departments that work at independently, right, in theory, on these programs. We know that they're going to be affected differently under this administration. And so it's going to be increasingly important to kind of understand what's happening in each branch. So for this year, we have these delays in the Department of Labor. USCIS has been just fine. There's been nothing really holding things back at the USCIS except for that initial reshuffling that we talked about in 2024 of the centers. Those issues seem to have been actually dealt with over the past couple of months. Texas Service Center has been working pretty well, except for when it came to releasing the workers, right? That wasn't a USCIS decision so much as a top-down Department of Homeland Security decision. And so now you have the consulates where we're actually having to bring in the workers and they have their own set of problems. So understanding that we have to deal with the Department of Labor, USCIS, above the USCIS, the Department of Homeland Security, and US consulates, it's a lot to keep track of. So I'm, again, going to plug in this newsletter, which you can find at the bottom of this description, that talks about where I'm going to be talking about every Monday about what I'm seeing and what I'm understanding the program to be. If you're an employer, okay, just to summarize, H-2B returning workers have been released. There's an additional release for the May 15th starters. We just had them, released last week. We got the first USCIS receipts yesterday. What that means is, and we've had these delays in certifications at the DOL level. So then you have these May 15th workers where people file February 15th or later for May 15th starters. I think those are going to start processing. I haven't seen any yet, so I'm guessing maybe next week. But those have been a little delayed. And so I expect your May 15th workers aren't going to be here until the end of May, is what I'm thinking. Now, these are all guesses, but they're educated in the sense that we've seen what these delays have done this year. Incredibly, DOL is ahead of its processing schedule from the previous year somehow, despite all of these delays. So there's a bit of a paradox there. Things are moving slower, maybe at the consulates, at the USCIS, but because DOL was ahead of schedule, we're still kind of where we were last year. But where we were at last year was still delayed. So maybe this is the new normal where we're just going to have lots of weird things happening every year. Okay. So that's kind of what I'm seeing in the H-2B space. I'm not going to lie. It's been really stressful waiting on these receipts. It's been really stressful trying to understand if the H-2B cap would be released. Everybody was on pins and needles in the agent and attorney and employer community. But for those of you who advocated, thank you. So, and I'm talking about advocating with your representatives. It's going to be important to do that going forward. So we have some questions. Okay, Chevelle actually asked the first one I done this with. Okay, Chevelle says, when a company gets an NOD, that's a notice of deficiency, how long after resubmission does it take to receive full certification? Well, first you're going to get a notice of acceptance or not. And typically, it's a bad sign if the NOD is sitting there for more than 10 or 15 days. Usually leads to a rejection. Not always, but usually. Then you can appeal it within 10 days. You can ask for an appeal hearing within 10 days to see if a BALCA, Board of Alien Labor Certification Appeals judge, agrees or disagrees with the officer. Sometimes it's a good idea to appeal. If you need help with that, we do handle appeals, but usually you should hear back on a smaller NOD within, let's say, 10 working days, which translates sometimes to 3 weeks. Any longer than that, you're probably looking at a rejection just based on a long sorted history with DOL. Let's see. Thank you for the newsletter. You are welcome. Again, there's a newsletter at the bottom. Thanks, Devin. What about additional workers from? Yeah, so those additional workers have been released from the beginning. So they're already released. That's the really interesting thing about the Northern Triangle Central American workers. They released them once in October, all of them at once. So you can file for those. You could have been filing for those this whole time, right? Those have always been there. Yeah, there's H-2B interview slots open. They're just going later and later in the month and into early May, especially like Mexico's the big one. That's the one I gauge by. But if you're like in New Zealand, if you're in South Africa, Romania, we're doing something like, you're going to have different interview spots that aren't going along with what I'm saying. I'm mostly looking at Mexico, Jamaica, Central America is kind of the spots here. The H-2B program skews towards those countries. No disrespect to others, just skews towards those countries. Any other questions for me? Okay. All right. Well, I do hope you sign up for the newsletter. Again, I'm going to try to start it in about 2 weeks. I'm going to just see what kind of interest there is. And thanks so much. I'm going to give it another moment or two, looking at to see if anybody asks a question. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I talked about this a few times. But, yeah, USAID, the agency that got gutted, and basically whatever's left of it is in the State Department, apparently under Marco Rubio. It was helping with Central American recruitment. There is no more U.S. government-aided help for recruitment, which is a bit of a below. But there are individual recruitment companies that do this kind of work. So you can find those. When is the best time for winter? So if you're thinking of applying for like a winter position, which is the earliest you can start is October 1st. And in fact, that season is big enough where you essentially, if you're a new worker, you're coming in like Devin said, he hasn't been back in the US since 2023. So you are a return. If you're a returnee, you can probably stand to apply maybe by August 1st. But keep in mind that July 1st, people are applying for October 1st starts, and this program already becomes overprescribed. So if there's no additional returning worker slots, okay, this is where it becomes complicated. That might be your only window to apply, right? As an employer, would be for in that July 1st through 3rd window to apply for an October 1st starting job. Because if there's no returning workers that are announced for the coming year, well, then folks who need people in December might be out of luck. That's what we're staring down the barrel of. And so I would say that, again, this is the Devin Smith's question here. If you are a winter employer, you might consider applying for July 1st on July 1st this year to try to get an October 1st start, because there might be no returning workers for you coming down the line. It's just the way it is. And you might have to depend on, the plan might be that you just bring in workers who are already in the United States. Okay. So it's tough. I'm in India, sir, employer, sponsor, visa history. Okay. Yeah, let me know. I'm interested to see how this India H-2B business goes and whether it works out. I've been skeptical that there's going to be approvals. It'd be interesting to see if there were. Okay. Yeah. And Devin, make sure that your employer is filing your prevailing wage round now, if they're going to be planning on doing that. And again, Frontier Labor does handle all those services, so you can reach out to us. All right. Anybody else? Any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, guys, thank you so much for participating. Have a lovely Friday, April 4th. Check out my glass. Look at that. Boom. Boom. How cool am I? No, I'm just kidding. And I will talk to you guys soon. Take care.